I want you to start by just picturing a number in your head.
A really big number.
Yeah, a number so incredibly large that it arguably stops being money and starts being like gravity.
Right.
It's a number that warps the geopolitical orbit of the entire planet. $75 trillion.
It is a figure that is almost impossible to visualize. I mean, to give you some context here, the entire U.S. national debt, the number that everyone is constantly wringing their hands about, is roughly 35 trillion.
So this is double that.
More than double, yeah. It is more wealth than most nations generate in a century.
And according to the source material we are covering today, that $75 trillion isn't debt.
No, it's not.
It's a prize. It is the valuation of the natural resources sitting in the ground in Russia right now.
Right.
And the theory we are unpacking today suggests that this prize, the $75 trillion, is the actual engine driving the Western world toward World War III.
It completely changes the whole narrative, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because we are so used to hearing about, democracy versus autocracy or good versus evil.
The standard political talking point.
Exactly. But today, we are going to look at a theory that says, just forget the morality plays for a second. This is a bank robbery.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating and frankly unnerving conversation with Martin Armstrong.
And we definitely need to set the table here because Armstrong isn't your typical Wall Street analyst.
No, definitely not. He's the founder of Armstrong Economics, but his background reads a lot more like a John Le Carre novel than a standard, LinkedIn profile.
He claims to have been one of the original architects called in to help design the euro back in its infancy.
Right, and he claims to have these back channels to the Kremlin and the White House.
He is a very controversial figure, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, he spent time in prison over contempt of court regarding his forecasting models.
Yeah, the computer models he built.
Right, and he has this very specific, cyclical view of history. He talks a lot about secret meetings, back channels to Putin, warnings from people inside the deep state.
So our mission today is to explore his grand unified theory of the current global crisis. And I want to be super clear right up front. We are exploring his worldview based on the sources provided.
We aren't endorsing it, we're just breaking it down.
Exactly. And it's a view that says the Western economies, specifically over in Europe, are in a terminal death spiral.
And because they are broke, they're desperate.
And desperate governments do desperate things.
That's the core of it.
So the thesis that really jumped out at me from the notes was this idea of the external enemy. Armstrong argues that governments just never give up power willingly.
Never.
When the economy collapses at home, when the people are literally ready to pick up pitchforks, the government has to manufacture a war abroad to keep everyone in line.
It's the classic wag the dog concept, but we are talking about it on a global scale with nuclear weapons potentially on the table.
Right.
If you can't give the people bread, you better give them a circus. Or war.
So here is our roadmap for this deep dive. We are going to break down why Armstrong thinks Europe is economically suicidal right now and why they desperately need that $75 trillion prize.
We'll also look at the neocons and why diplomacy in Ukraine seems to be, dead on arrival, according to him.
And we really have to get into the shadow world stuff.
Oh, yeah, that gets deep.
Armstrong draws some incredibly dark lines connecting the CIA, the fall of the Soviet Union, and Jeffrey Epstein.
I am still trying to wrap my head around the Epstein connection, to be honest. But we will get there.
We will. And finally, we'll talk about what all this means for your money. Capital flight, the money skirt.
The money skirt is such a crazy story.
We'll definitely get to that. And why the stock market might actually go up even if the world is falling apart.
It is a lot to unpack.
Let's start with the history side of things. Armstrong is a cyclical analyst. He believes history repeats itself with mathematical precision. And to explain what's happening in Europe right now, he takes us all the way back to Iran in 1979.
This is a really insightful comparison, I thought, because most of us know the surface story of the Iranian Revolution.
The Shah falls.
The Shah falls, the Ayatollah Khomeini takes over, and then students storm the U.S. Embassy and take hostages.
Right. And the standard history book answer is that this was just religious rage. They hated America, the great Satan.
It was ideological, yeah. That's the narrative. But Armstrong says, look closer. Look at the actual incentives at play.
Okay.
When the Ayatollah took power, His position was actually incredibly fragile. There were massive protests happening. There were different factions like communists, secularists, people who absolutely did not want a theocracy.
He was basically facing a potential civil war.
Exactly. So he needed a distraction. He needed a glue, something to bind the country together under his rule.
So by sanctioning the takeover of the U.S. Embassy, he creates this immediate, very tangible external enemy.
Yes. And suddenly, if you were protesting the Ayatollah on the street, you weren't just a political opponent anymore. You were a sympathizer with the great Satan.
Wow. It completely reframed the internal debate into a treason debate.
It did.
That is incredibly cynical, but it makes a lot of sense from a power perspective. It forced everyone to pick a side.
It silenced the opposition overnight. And Armstrong points out a key detail here. The Ayatollah kept those hostages for 444 days.
Right.
He didn't release them because he couldn't negotiate. He didn't release them because he didn't want to.
Because the crisis was useful?
As long as the crisis existed, his power was secure. Once he had purged his internal enemies and totally solidified the regime, the hostages were suddenly let go.
And Armstrong is arguing that the current Iranian government is doing the exact same thing right now.
That's what his computer models are suggesting. They picked up a shift in Iran around February. He argues they are facing severe economic headwinds again. The population is getting restless.
So what do?
They rattle the saber. They need an external conflict to prevent the people from picking up pitchforks.
Okay, so that is the playbook. You create a monster abroad to tame the monster at home.
Yep.
But here is the part that is really unsettling. He applies this exact same framework to modern Europe.
This is the crux of his whole argument regarding World War III. He looks at the European economy right now and just sees a total disaster zone.
We are talking about growth rates hovering around 0.3%.
Barely growing at all. While the U.S. is chugging along much faster, the German industrial base is cracking. You have farmers protesting in France and the Netherlands.
Yeah, I've seen the footage of the tractors just blocking the major highways. It looks intense.
It is intense. And Armstrong says the European leaders, Macron, Scholz, all the bureaucrats in Brussels, they are terrified.
Because they know the social contract is breaking.
Exactly. They can't pay for the pensions long term. They can't keep the standard of living up. So they really only have two choices. Admit they failed and lose all their power, or
Find a boogeyman.
Find a boogeyman. And Armstrong argues that the current narrative, this idea that Russia is going to invade all of Europe, is that boogeyman.
He calls it total theater.
Total theater. He was very adamant about that. He said historically, Russia has never actually tried to conquer Europe.
He points out that the arrow of conquest usually points the other way, right?
Yeah. Napoleon went to Moscow. Hitler went to Stalingrad. Armstrong asks a very simple, almost purely economic question. Why would Russia even want Europe?
Because it's there. I mean, that's a usual assumption with empires.
But think about it like a ruthless businessman. Europe has virtually no significant gold reserves left. It has depleted its natural resources over centuries.
That's true.
It has a massive aging population that requires huge expensive pension payouts. It has to import its energy. If you conquer Europe, you don't actually get rich. You just inherit a massive liability.
You are acquiring a bankrupt company.
Exactly. But the reverse. If Europe looks east, that is a very different story. And that brings us right back to the $75 trillion.
An ultimate resource grab.
Armstrong argues that Europe is the desperate party in this equation. They're the ones who are fundamentally bankrupt. And they look east and they see the absolute richest country on earth in terms of in-ground assets.
Let's break down what actually constitutes that $75 trillion, because it's not just cash in a vault.
No, it's everything you need to run a modern industrial society. Russia has the world's largest natural gas reserves. They have massive oil deposits.
Right.
They are a top producer of diamonds, gold, platinum. They have incredibly huge timber resources. And critically, they have the rare earth minerals you need for high-tech manufacturing and the green energy transition.
So Armstrong's theory is that the neocons and the European elite actually want to break Russia up to get at this stuff.
Yes. He points to comments from leaders like Kallis in Estonia who suggested Russia is quote-unquote too big. Armstrong interprets this as a clear desire to partition the country. Because if you can break Russia up into 4 or 5 smaller, weaker states, Western companies can just move right in.
They can secure the drilling rights.
The drilling rights, the mining rights, they can essentially use those stolen assets to bail out the failing European banking system.
It's a corporate raid disguised as a military operation.
That's exactly how he sees it. He even compares modern European leaders to Napoleon, saying they have this sort of resurrected Roman Empire complex,
Meaning what, exactly?
meaning they want to unify the entire Eurasian landmass under European rule simply to save themselves from economic irrelevance.
But we have to ask, how did Europe get this broken in the first place? Because we generally think of Europe as wealthy, as stable.
Well, Armstrong lists a whole litany of what he calls self-inflicted wounds. He really tears into their economic management over the last few decades.
One of the big ones he mentions is protectionism, right?
Yeah, we tend to think of the EU as this great free trade zone, but he says they are actually obsessed with blocking competition from the outside.
He gave that really funny example about the champagne.
Yeah, he mentioned how you can't sell California sparkling wine as champagne in France.
Right, it's protected.
Or how they will ban foreign produce if it uses a specific fertilizer they don't like. He sees these rules not as genuine safety standards, but as non-tariff trade barriers.
Just designed to protect inefficient European industries from having to actually compete.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the energy crisis.
This seems like a huge piece of the puzzle.
It is massive. Armstrong argues that the sanctions placed on Russia were essentially a suicidal move for European industry, especially for Germany.
Because Germany was the engine of the whole EU.
Right, and Germany built its entire industrial powerhouse model on a very simple equation. High-tech engineering plus incredibly cheap Russian gas equals massive profit.
And then they cut the gas line.
They cut the line. And energy costs in Germany just exploded. You have major chemical companies, heavy manufacturers, openly talking about leaving Germany entirely because they literally cannot afford the electric bill anymore.
Wow.
Armstrong says they destroyed their own core competitive advantage to try and hurt Putin, but they ended up hurting themselves far, far more.
And we really can't talk about Europe's economic failure without talking about the euro itself.
No, we can't.
And this is where Armstrong claims he was actually in the room when it was being designed.
This is one of those moments where his specific background really adds a lot of weight to the story. He claims he was called in to consult on the creation of the euro before it launched.
Okay.
And he says he told them, flat out to their faces, this currency will fail unless you consolidate the debt.
Can you explain that for the listener? Why does the debt actually need to be consolidated for a currency to work?
Sure. Think about how the United States operates. We have a single currency, the dollar, and we have a single federal debt market, which is U.S. Treasury bonds.
Right.
If the state of Florida goes bankrupt tomorrow, it doesn't destroy the global value of the U.S. dollar because the national debt is federal. It's backed by the whole country.
Got it.
But in Europe, they created a single currency, the euro, but they kept separate national debts for Germany, Italy, Greece, France.
So an Italian bond is fundamentally different from a German bond, even though they are both denominated in the exact same money.
Exactly. German bonds are considered very safe. Greek bonds are considered very risky. Armstrong says he warned the architects that this structural flaw would eventually blow the whole system up.
And he shares this amazing anecdote about Chancellor Helmut Kohl of Germany during that time.
The dictator moment.
Basically, yeah.
Armstrong alleges that Kohl actually admitted privately that he couldn't consolidate the debt. And the reason was that the German voters would never, ever agree to bail out countries like Greece or Italy.
So what did he do?
Kohl pushed the euro through unilaterally. He didn't let the German people vote on adopting the euro because he knew he would lose the referendum. He figured the politicians would just fix the debt problem later.
And here we are 30 years later.
And they still haven't fixed it. And Armstrong argues that because of this original sin, the euro can never truly compete with the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency.
The bond market just isn't deep enough or uniform enough to be safe.
Right. And he had that hilarious but dark story about asking European officials a hypothetical question.
Oh, yeah, about what happens if a country gets kicked out.
Yeah, he asked them, if Italy leaves the EU, what happens to the physical euro notes that were printed in Italy?
Because each note has a serial code identifying which country's central bank printed it.
Exactly. And the officials basically looked at him and said, good question. We didn't think about that.
That is just terrifying incompetence if it's true. Literally saying we didn't think about that for a major currency.
It perfectly illustrates his broader point. The people in charge are bureaucrats who don't actually understand how global markets function. And now that their flawed system is finally cracking, they're looking for a war to cover their tracks.
Which leads us directly into the situation in Ukraine. And Armstrong does not mince words here at all. He bluntly calls Ukraine cannon fodder.
It is a really brutal assessment. He argues that the Rust, specifically the U.S. and NATO leadership, is using Ukraine solely to deplete Russia's military capabilities.
He claims European officials told him privately that they, quote, don't give a shit if there's one Ukrainian left.
To them, it's just pieces on a chessboard. And Armstrong goes even darker with this. He brings up the history of Ukraine back in World War II.
Right, the allegations about Nazi collaborators.
He alleges that the West has purposely turned a blind eye to extremist elements in Ukraine because those elements have historically been useful against Russia.
He talks about the lack of Nuremberg-style trials for certain Ukrainian factions after the war.
And he outright claims the CIA actively protected them to use them as an anti-Soviet buffer.
It's a very controversial view of history, obviously, but it completely aligns with his main thesis that the West simply views Ukraine as a disposable tool.
Definitely.
But the part of this section that I found the absolute most fascinating was his claim about his own personal involvement in a potential peace deal.
Oh, the peace plan story. This is wild. Armstrong claims he was actually approached by people in Washington.
People who were sanctioned by the administration to do this?
Right. He says he was asked to write a peace plan that Putin would actually accept, because Armstrong supposedly has these trusted back channels to Moscow.
So he says he wrote the plan, and it involved Russia keeping Crimea and holding a proper, internationally monitored vote in the Donbas region regarding their status.
But the really big concession, the core of the deal, was a guarantee that Ukraine would never join NATO.
And he says Putin actually saw this document.
He claims he got this exact plan onto Putin's desk. And shortly after that happened, he says both Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and Putin himself made public statements.
Saying what?
Saying they had no interest in invading actual NATO countries. Armstrong saw this as a very clear diplomatic signal that they were open to his framework.
So it seemed like there was a real opening, a moment where this whole conflict could have ended.
According to Armstrong, yes. But then he says the neocons swept in and sabotaged the whole thing.
He specifically calls out Senator Marco Rubio here.
He does. He says right after that Russian peace overture, Rubio came out publicly guaranteeing that Ukraine would never be barred from joining NATO.
Effectively killing the deal on the spot.
Exactly. And Armstrong says he later received a personal letter from Donald Trump thanking him for making the attempt.
Which he uses to highlight a massive political rift in Washington right now.
Right. He says the old paradigm of Democrats versus Republicans is dead. The real fight now is the neocons, the pro-war establishment in both parties, versus everyone else.
And the real danger of this sabotage, according to Armstrong, is that the West has become completely delusional about Russia's weakness.
This is where his warnings get extremely dire. He says Western leaders have actually bought into their own propaganda. They genuinely believe Russia is just on the verge of economic and military collapse.
They think if they just push a little harder, fund a few more weapons, Putin will fall.
And Armstrong says this is a deadly miscalculation. He says if you actually push Russia to the brink of total defeat, if you actually threaten the existential survival of the Russian state,
Putin, or whoever replaces him, will push the nuclear button.
He said, quote, "I certainly would," which is just a chilling thing to hear an analyst say out loud.
It really is.
But it's basic game theory. If the choice is the total destruction and partition of my country or push the button, the normal logic of deterrence completely breaks down.
Right. There's no reason not to launch.
Armstrong is warning that by trying to win a total crushing victory, by trying to grab that $75 trillion prize, the West is literally risking total global annihilation.
Okay, I want to pivot now because we've talked about the geopolitics, the economics, but Armstrong introduces this whole other layer to his theory, the shadow world.
Yeah.
He connects this massive geopolitical game to the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. And I have to say, when I first saw this in the source material, I thought, okay, this is going to be a massive stretch.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like one at first.
But the way he explains the mechanics of it,
It's certainly a unique and cohesive take. We are so used to hearing about Epstein strictly in the context of a horrific sex trafficking ring, a scandal involving wealthy men and underage girls.
right, a criminal enterprise of abuse.
But Armstrong says, step back and look at the function. Forget the sex for a minute. The sex was just a tool. The real story is high-level intelligence and systemic blackmail.
He calls it a club.
A club, yeah. He argues that Epstein wasn't just some lone predator working for himself. He was an operative. The explicit goal was to compromise heads of state, major financial leaders, powerful figures, in order to control their policy decisions.
Because if you have photos or videos of a prime minister or a Wall Street CEO doing something heinous, you basically own them.
You own them completely. And he connects this whole operation back to Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell.
This is the historical thread that kind of anchors his theory. Walk us through the Robert Maxwell connection.
Well, Robert Maxwell was publicly known as a massive British media tycoon. But according to many sources, including Armstrong, he was also a super spy.
With links to who?
Links to Mossad, MI6, and the KGB. He played all sides. And Armstrong claims Maxwell was actually the mastermind behind the 1991 hardliner coup against Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union.
Wait, the coup that tried to stop the collapse of the USSR?
Yes. Armstrong says the secret deal was that the coup leaders would release Russian Jews to emigrate to Israel, and in exchange, they would get Western recognition or financial support facilitated by Maxwell.
But the coup famously failed. Gorbachev survived, Yeltsin took over.
Right, the coup failed. And Maxwell had allegedly been financing his end of these operations using hundreds of millions in stolen pension funds from his media empire.
And then suddenly he falls off his yacht.
Conveniently, as Armstrong puts it. Maxwell drowned right before he was supposed to testify to the Bank of England about the missing money.
Oh.
Armstrong is heavily suggesting he was taken out because he knew way too much, the Soviet operation failed, and he became a liability. And then, look who ends up dating Maxwell's daughter a few years later.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Exactly. So Armstrong sees Epstein as basically inheriting the family business. And he doesn't mean the publishing business. He means the elite blackmail and intelligence business.
That is wild. So he dismisses the idea that Epstein was a Russian asset, which is a theory you hear sometimes.
Yeah, he links Epstein much more to Western intelligence or Mossad, basically doing the dirty work of keeping powerful Western people in line with the club's agenda.
And he even ties this club directly to the 2008 financial crash. This was the story about AIG.
This is a really complex financial coup, if you follow Armstrong's logic. He talks about how Elliot Spitzer, the hard-charging New York prosecutor who eventually became governor, was essentially used as a pawn.
Okay, break that down, because Spitzer went after Hank Greenberg, right?
Hank Greenberg was the legendary head of AIG.
AIG being the massive, globally systemic insurance company.
Exactly. Now, Armstrong claims Greenberg was actually refusing to underwrite or insure those toxic mortgage-backed securities that eventually caused the 2008 crash.
He wouldn't touch them.
He wouldn't touch them. But the club, the big Wall Street players, needed those specific securities insured by AIG so they could sell them to pension funds as AAA-rated safe assets.
So Greenberg is in the way.
He's blocking the whole scam. So according to Armstrong, they fed Elliot Spitzer a bunch of information to take Greenberg down on accounting charges.
And once Greenberg is forced out of AIG,
a new, more compliant management team comes in. They immediately insure the toxic assets. Goldman Sachs gets their AAA ratings, and the housing bubble inflates massively until it finally bursts and destroys the economy.
And then what happens to Spitzer?
Well, when Spitzer later tried to turn his sights on Wall Street and start prosecuting the big banks, suddenly his own massive scandal with a high-end prostitution ring gets leaked to the press, and he's forced to resign in disgrace.
It's a worldview where almost everyone is a disposable pawn to these higher-level players.
It is, and Armstrong says he purposely stayed far away from the Epstein files and that whole crowd because he was warned years ago by his own intelligence contacts to avoid these people at all costs.
He said something like, I just held up the silver cross and said, go away.
Yeah, he claims he knew it was a total trap from day one. It really reinforces his core worldview that the major events we see on the news, the political scandals, the financial crashes, the wars, they're very often engineered or manipulated by this deeper layer of power players.
So if the world is really run by desperate, bankrupt governments, neocon warhawks, and these shadow blackmail clubs, what does that practically mean for us?
Right. How do you survive it?
Exactly. What does it mean for our money? Because despite all the geopolitical theory, Armstrong is first and foremost a financial forecaster.
This is where we get to the financial survival section of the notes. And the picture his models paint is incredibly volatile. The very first thing he talks about is capital flight.
Money rapidly moving to safety.
Right. He says big capital, the really smart institutional money, is actively fleeing Europe and the Middle East right now. It sees the economic writing on the wall. It sees the war coming.
So where does all that money go? Usually people say Switzerland is the ultimate safe haven.
Not anymore. Armstrong says Switzerland is totally done as a premier safe haven.
Why is that?
Because they broke their historic neutrality. When Switzerland joined the Western sanctions and actively confiscated Russian private assets, they signaled to the rest of the world that your money is only safe there if the current government happens to like you.
Ah, I see.
If you are a Chinese billionaire or Saudi prince or just an independent businessman, you simply don't trust the Swiss banking system anymore.
Because they proved they will freeze your accounts based on politics. So if not Switzerland, where's the money actually going?
The United States.
Mm.
And this capital flight explains one of Armstrong's most counterintuitive, almost crazy-sounding predictions. He says the Dow Jones Industrial Average could hit 50,000.
Which, on the surface, sounds like he's predicting a massive, booming, healthy economy.
Right, but he says it's not that at all. It's not about great corporate earnings or a healthy consumer. It's purely about safety in numbers.
How does that work?
Well, if you have billions of euros and you seriously think the euro currency might collapse or that Europe might physically become a war zone, you have to buy U.S.-denominated assets. And specifically, you buy the blue-chip Dow stocks.
Because they're too big to fail.
Because if the Dow crashes to zero, the whole global system has ended anyway. It's the absolute last ship floating on the ocean.
That is a really grim reason for a massive stock market rally. It's not optimism, it's blind panic.
Precisely. He also mentions places like Dubai as a new rising safe haven and Singapore. But the U.S. equities market is still the biggest bucket to catch all that fleeing capital.
He even mentioned a rumor about Trump and a new type of bond.
Yeah, he mentioned a rumor or maybe a forecast that if Trump returns to power or heavy influence, there might be a new 50-year U.S. bond issued.
And it would be backed by gold.
Possibly backed by gold, yes. And the purpose would be to purposely soak up all this terrified refugee capital flowing out of Europe and use it to stabilize the U.S. financial system.
Wow, a gold-backed U.S. Treasury bond. That would fundamentally change global finance.
It would be a massive paradigm shift. But on the flip side of all this big money talk, there is what he calls the war on the little guy's money, the war on cash.
He talked quite a bit about how hard it is to just use physical cash in Europe right now.
It's extremely aggressive over there.
Yep.
There are strict legal limits on cash transactions in places like France and Spain. You literally can't buy anything over 1,000 euros in physical cash in some jurisdictions.
And Armstrong says this is entirely about state control.
100%. They want to force everyone into digital banking systems and eventually into CBDCs, which are central bank digital currencies.
So they can track everything.
So they can ensure absolute 100% tax compliance, and more importantly, so they can totally prevent bank runs.
Because if your money is entirely digital, you can't go down to the branch and pull it out to stuff under your mattress when the banking system starts failing.
Exactly, you are trapped in the system. And he also views things like stablecoins, the crypto tokens pegged to the dollar, as just the modern version of Civil War debt financing.
Private banks issuing currency backed by government debt to fund the state's war machine.
It's a cycle repeating itself.
Which brings us to arguably my favorite specific story from this entire interview, the money skirt.
Oh man, this is such a vivid, incredible image.
Tell the story for the listener.
So Armstrong is recounting a story from his early days working as a major physical gold dealer. A woman came into his office who had recently escaped from communist Russia.
Okay.
And to get her wealth out of the Soviet system, she couldn't use banks, obviously. She couldn't use paper rubles. They were worthless outside.
So what did she do?
She had a custom skirt made out of wire, and she painted the wire flat black, so it just looked like a normal part of the fabric, or like a stiffener for the garment.
But the wire wasn't steel.
The wire was pure, solid gold.
Wow.
She literally wore her entire life savings across the heavily guarded border. Armstrong calls it a money skirt.
And the lesson there is just stark.
Extremely stark. When war comes, when capital control slams shut overnight, the electronic banking system instantly becomes a prison. You can't wire your money. You can't withdraw your money.
The ATMs just shut off.
They shut off. You absolutely need physical assets, gold, silver, something tangible, if you want to survive the transition or physically escape the country.
And he mentioned that physical travel stops just as fast, too.
Yes. He warned that once the first bullet is shot in a wider declared European war, the national borders will close immediately.
He used the recent attacks in Israel as a real-time example of this.
Right. The moment the conflict started, commercial flights stopped almost instantly. If you're an expat in Europe and things really go south, you might be physically stuck there, and your money might be entirely stuck in a frozen, inaccessible bank account.
That is a very sobering thought. We are all so incredibly used to the freedom of movement, the freedom of pulling out our phones and moving money globally in seconds. The idea that it could all just shut down in 24 hours.
It has happened many times before. Armstrong's whole philosophical point is that history is a cycle. We aren't special. We aren't magically immune to the exact same patterns that destroyed Rome or the Weimar Republic.
We are just living in the next turn of the wheel.
We are just the next turn.
So let's talk timeline then. When does the wheel turn next? Because Armstrong was actually pretty specific about his model's dates.
He was. He specifically mentioned the Ides of March. His computer models project a major directional change, or a severe escalation in the war cycle, starting in March, and then really heating up through April and May.
So we were essentially entering the primary danger zone right now.
According to his data, yes.
Yeah.
He sees this upcoming period as absolutely critical. The internal economic pressure in Europe is peaking, the farmer protests are spreading, and the governments are getting increasingly desperate for a distraction.
He also noted the political shifts happening inside the U.S. right now. He seems to think there's a very real, very consequential battle happening in Washington.
He framed it very clearly as the neocons versus the anti-war faction.
Mm-hmm.
He put Trump and RFK Jr. squarely in that anti-war isolationist bucket. And he put establishment politicians like Rubio in the neocon pro-war bucket.
And he argues that this internal political fight in the U.S. is basically the only thing potentially holding back the full-scale escalation in Europe.
That's his view, yes.
And he kind of entirely dismissed all the cultural war stuff we see in the media, right? The woke debates.
He did. He brushed it off. He called the constant debates about transgender issues and social policies in the U.S. and Europe absolute absurdity.
He acknowledges they're happening, obviously.
Sure, but he views them purely as engineered distractions or just the natural symptoms of a dying empire losing its focus.
Yeah.
His point is, while the public is busy arguing violently about bathroom signs, the actual economic foundation is crumbling beneath our feet and the nuclear missiles are being loaded into the silos.
It certainly puts things into a harsh perspective.
It really does. It forces you to look at the macro picture.
So we have unpacked a lot of theory today. Europe is functionally broke. They desperately want to partition Russia for a $75 trillion resource prize.
They are using Ukraine as cannon fodder to weaken the target.
Right. The deep state, or this global club, uses intelligence and blackmail networks like Epstein's to keep Western leaders in line with the plan.
And the smart institutional money sees it all happening and is fleeing to the U.S. markets before the trap finally snaps shut.
That is the Martin Armstrong worldview in a nutshell.
It is a lot to take in.
It is. And look, we have to acknowledge it is highly controversial. A lot of mainstream analysts would call this pure conspiracy theory. A lot of historians would strongly dispute his specific take on Ukraine or the intentions of the neocons.
Absolutely. And as consumers of information, we should always be skeptical of anyone who claims to have the one true grand unified theory of everything.
Of course.
But what makes Armstrong's analysis genuinely compelling, whether you buy into every detail or not, is that he connects the dots in a way that rigidly follows the money.
He ignores the rhetoric.
He completely ignores the political rhetoric. He doesn't rely on ideology to explain state behavior. He relies on economic incentives. And the incentive of a $75 trillion prize is a very, very powerful motivator for war.
It just forces you to ask different questions when you consume the news.
Exactly.
When you see a breaking headline about Western leaders needing to defend democracy abroad, you have to stop and ask, who is actually paying for this? Who directly profits from this conflict? And what domestic crisis are they trying to distract me from?
And I think that is the real value of doing this kind of deep dive into alternative frameworks. You absolutely don't have to agree with every single conclusion Armstrong draws to appreciate the utility of his lens.
Right.
Because if you just try looking at the world through the lens of desperate, bankrupt governments simply trying to survive their own failures, a lot of the crazy, inexplicable news we see every day suddenly makes a really scary amount of sense.
So here's the thought we want to leave you with today. It's a provocative question to chew on.
Let's hear it.
If Armstrong's models are right, if the patriotic drums of war we keep hearing are actually just the dinner bell ringing for a massive geopolitical resource feast, are we really watching a noble fight for global freedom? Or are we just watching the absolute largest bank robbery in human history unfold in real time?
And if it really is just a robbery, you need to make sure you aren't the one left holding the empty bag when the music stops.
Keep an eye on the boring economic data. Try to ignore the loud political noise, and maybe, just maybe, look into getting yourself a money skirt.
Couldn't hurt to have one in the closet.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you on the next one.
Stay safe out there.